Hello? Hello?
Hello, everyone.
Are we live? I presume we're live. Hey, everyone. I'm really sick, so I'm going to sound weird. But yeah, I managed to get a Jewel of the Indigo Isles working like literally nonstop for months. And then as soon as it came out on Saturday night, I got sick. And I've been sick ever since. So, how are you doing, Mark, other than that? Other than me being
I
sick?
mean, I'm at least not sick, so that's good. But I definitely have a lot of things going on. I'm trying to get through some more Year of Monsters so that I can start working on that Elemental Avatar playtest that I'm hoping we can get out by the end of March. But like, we'll see. I have a lot of other things going on, just like in the background. But I think that's what we're shooting for. So I'm feeling pretty hopeful about that. I guess this is my first year of doing taxes since joining with Roll for Combat, so that's going to be an exciting adventure.
Oh my
Since I
God!
am
Tell us more about your Texas. This you couldn't have
no,
got. I know,
no,
like okay,
Stephen.
everyone left. Up, we're all by ourselves.
Yeah,
Good job.
I'm not going to. I'm just saying that's going. It's a little frightening, but also like the amount that people were trying to charge to do what should be straightforward calculations was a lot of money. So I'm trying to figure it out.
No, there you go. That's the problem. Anyhow, um, yeah. There was also a third-party con that was hosted here over the weekend.
That's right.
I saw some of it, but I was really sick, so I
Yeah,
didn't
there were a
see
lot
it.
of interesting streams that were going on in third party con.
Mm-hmm. So we are going to talk a little bit about this cool topic, which is movie tricks to enhance your D&D and Pathfinder games. And the main reason we brought this up, there's a lot of reasons. It was actually Mark's idea, but I've been saying this all along is that so the Jewel of the Indigo Isle is our adventure path that just came out and it's finally done. It's out for Pathfinder 100%. It's 95-ish percent done for 5e. It'll be done in just a couple more. If I wasn't so sick, I'd probably have it done this week, but it'll probably be done by next week, the 5e version. And then that's it. And then the adventure's done,
Yeah.
and then it goes to the printer, and that's it.
I've
But
heard so many good movie tips from you in other streams that we've done that that's why I was like, let's just do a stream where the topic is that we can hear your top 5 movie tricks
yeah,
instead of just sort of having them in the middle of other streams show up. And that way people who want to focus on that and to
hmm
make their adventures really pop using movie tricks can watch this stream even whenever they want to and learn those techniques.
yeah. Like one of the things I did is now obviously I've been playing since the 70s, so I've read all the classic adventures, and then I read a lot of the second and third edition adventures. I even read a lot of the fourth edition adventures, and I've read some of the fifth edition adventures, and I've obviously read almost every adventure path. And I did a ton of research, and there's one thing I've noticed over and over again is that these adventures, they don't seem to use conventional storytelling, and there's a lot of tips and tricks if you ever take a script writing class or if you're into movies or plays, that there's all these conventions to the point that if you write a script on specific pages, things happen. So a script is 1 minute per page. And if you are reading scripts for Hollywood, and this is what you do for a living, they do this on purpose so that people who are reading these scripts, because they might have to read 20 scripts a day, and each script's about 120 pages. So how on earth are you reading 1,000, 2,000 pages a day? Scripts, you're not, because on page, I forget the exact numbers because my head's a little foggy because I'm sick, but it's like on page 62 is when there's like an act break and there's something exciting happens. And on page 40, this is when this happens. And on page 50 something, this happens. So in specific pages is when things happen. So if you're reading scripts, they usually will just read the first few pages and then they'll jump to the specific act breaks of the pages where specific things happen, because all scripts, for better for worse, start off kind of the same structure. And this allows people to scripts quickly without having to read all 120 pages. And then if they think it's interesting, then they'll read the whole thing. So that's kind of a tip or trick in Hollywood of how they read these scripts. There's about 1 billion books out on this. A lot of them are really good, but scripts are very regimented and sort of cookie cutter, but in a good way. If you look at all successful movies, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Avatar or Star Wars or, any of these movies, they all have very similar structures. The really good ones do these structures in such a way that you don't even know that it's occurring. And what I found is almost no adventures that I could see used any of these standard script structures. And I was kind of surprised because they work very well in television, they work very well in video games, and they work very well in movies. And I'm like, why is no one doing this? Hell, it works really well. Books do the same thing. Brandon Sanderson is very good at this. He's actually superb at these structures I'm going to talk about. And I just couldn't believe it. So one of the things I did when I structured Jewel the Indigo Isle is, I structured the adventure and then we had 3 writers write it, is that it was built using this movie structure for each adventure. And everyone I know who's played the adventure loves it and says it's fantastic, and I can't figure out why. And it's funny because I used to also teach design for many years, and design is one of the things I used to tell is that the difference between designers and people who are designers and non-designers is that everyone intuitively knows when something looks good. You might look at something, an Apple product or a sports car, and say, wow, why does that look better? What about that makes it so much more interesting to me? And a designer can put into words why it's more interesting, as opposed to a non-designer who just knows they like it, but they don't know why. So my goal here is to hopefully give you some tips and tricks, and you can then see, wow, this adventure is really good, but why is this adventure good? Or I like this part of some adventure, why? And I'll give you some reasons, maybe hopefully that can help you out. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask questions. Super chats will answer right away. And obviously subscribe, like the channel, and we'll get into it. So we're going to have at least 5. I probably might have more than 5. But one of the very first things I did, excuse me, as I said I was sick, is ABE. Always be escalating, okay? This is most standard one, and this one's usually done in most adventures or most better adventures. You always have to escalate, okay? It sounds, how can you continuously escalate? Well, you just do, okay? You got to make the stakes higher and higher and higher. You can't make the stakes ever go lower. And you always start off your adventure. I mean, the best is like, think of, I'll bring it up a lot because everyone knows it, is The Hobbit, or more specifically Lord of the Rings, is that it starts off so small of like literally just in the Shire, and by the end it is literally saving the world, armies battling each other. It's just out of control what is going on because of this one little tiny adventure and this one tiny incident. And throughout it, it kept getting bigger and bigger. You have the Battle of Helm's Deep, and then you have the Battle for the Ring, and then you have going into Mordor. I mean, there's so many escalations in that, and it really captures the imagination and obviously keeps you involved because it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And that's why it's successful as a book. That's also, if you take a look at things like Endgame, which, whatever you might say about those movies, they did a really good job of drawing you in and escalating the odds, especially after the first movie when Thanos successfully snaps and kills half the universe. And you're like, spoilers if you haven't seen it by now. But that is like that. We're talking about, oh my God, boy, is that escalation, because no one expect him to win. And then you're like, now what? But that's the thing. It's like, it sounds so simple. And this is like one of these, like, why didn't I think of this? You always have to be escalating. You always have to make the stakes bigger and bigger. And
so I want to give a corollary to that, though, to make sure that people interpret you right on that. You're always escalating the stakes, but that doesn't mean that it's a relentless death march towards those higher stakes.
Right.
A good structure for a movie or a play or a book or your game also includes stress release valves at occasional time. That doesn't mean you've de-escalated. It just means that you found a moment of peace or a moment of calm before the storm that can help you to sort of distinguish between things. Because if you're always constantly at maximum stress levels, it can kind of wear off the effect of it. So one example of this that I like to use is in Macbeth. They're always escalating. It just starts out and there's like a small scale insurrection. It goes to like murder and betrayal and this whole situation with Macbeth, but they still take the time to make certain scenes that kind of de-escalate the pressure, but don't de-escalate the stakes. Like the drunken porter coming in and just kind of joking around and being funny right before the king is reported murdered in his room. So it can help you to sort of clarify and distinguish the moments that are big moments if you have moments that are a little more peaceful, but it doesn't mean that you're not always escalating the stakes.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise Shakespeare, and I'm like a gargantuan Shakespeare fan. I love reading Shakespeare and watching Shakespeare plays. It's that he is a master at escalating, obviously. Probably Twelfth Night, which is a comedy, it continuously gets out of control. Like it's just the escalation is so much so that by the end it's just total insanity, and that's a comedy. So it doesn't have to be an escalation of action, it's just an escalation of stakes, and by doing that it continuously makes you invested and anxious, which is a good thing. And I will give you tip 1.5. This isn't an official tip that I have written down, but the other one is that it's scientifically proven, and all these kind of gel into this tip, is that if you have a strong emotional reaction to something, that you will remember it. Okay? There's a lot of studies on this, and if anytime you have a strong emotional reaction, it can actually create neurons in your brain and like make permanent connections. And so that's why a lot of people try to do that and, like try to make you feel something. Now, I know people feel a lot when they're playing playing games. So this shouldn't be too tricky, but if you're always escalating or any of these other tricks, people are going to be feeling the stakes, feeling the pressure, and feeling scared. And that's good. Like, I actually see some comments here that people, it's like, oh, it gives me anxiety when it comes to playing my games. Good. Actually, not good for you getting anxiety, but the anxiety is a good thing because then people are going to remember the game and then they're going to want to keep playing it. It's the same reason people see scary movies or go on roller coasters. It's the excitement that really gets them and keeps their heart pumping. And
it does depend on your group. Some people
Fair
just
enough.
kind of want a comfy game that they can just go to and hang out, and that they're not in a gripping sort of situation that is going to give them that pressure. I've definitely talked about that with my gaming group before, because we often do have those situations, but there have been some times when someone was like, I have too much anxiety from other things. Can we go a little lighter in the next session? Or things like that.
It doesn't have to be anxiety, but the point is you want to have something that gives them an emotional response. And it could be happy, it could be joking, it could be sad, it doesn't have to be just excitement or anxiety. That's the reason why a lot of people joke at these games, because it's fun and, it's something that's a way to relieve pressure and to relieve anxiety.
Absolutely. I mean, humor was the example I used for when you put things down, when you like sort of tamp down the pressure. It doesn't have to be all pressure for the stakes to keep going up. And it's important that you don't want them to get numb to the stakes. Like, you don't want to escalate in a way that it doesn't feel like you're escalating, because they get so numb to how high the level is that they can barely notice the escalation anymore. And that's part of why changing things up will make the escalation stronger, because it feels more like oh my gosh, this is increased.
So the other one I wanted to talk about, Tip number 2 is the 3-act structure. And the 3-act structure is basically, just think of it this way: beginning, middle, end. That's it. That's a 3-act structure. You've heard it before. You've heard the terms. You can look it up. There's a lot of ways to define it, but the basic 3-act structure, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And probably the best recent example of something that I saw that did this, that is almost an adventure path or an adventure, would have been Andor. If you've watched Star Wars Andor, it is genius. And one of the reasons why, and I suggest everyone watch the show, it does go a little slow at times, but trust me, it's worth it, is that it's 12 episodes, but there's 4 groups of 3 episodes. So what does that mean? Episode 1, 2, and 3 is its own story. And it's literally a 3-act structure. It's a beginning, middle, end. Episode 4, 5, and 6, 3-act structure, its own story, beginning, middle, end, and so forth. So there's 4 3-act structures telling one gigantic interconnected story. I can't think of a better example of an adventure path if I tried. This is perhaps the best example of an adventure path ever, because it is, I could see each one of these 3-act structures as their own books. If this was like a 4-part adventure path, I could see you doing each of these 4 books. He actually gets more experience and it levels up throughout the adventure, because he starts off kind of low level, Andor himself, and then he goes and continuously grows throughout the adventure. It is genius. The writing and structure of the show is incredible. And if you want to see how to do 3-act structure and adventure path, I'd recommend that. But for your own adventure paths, is that don't do the George R. Martin, which is, he would do a 2-act structure. He would do a beginning and a middle, and he would never end anything. It just kept going. It was endless middles, and he just kept making the story get bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point that it was nearly impossible to keep track of what was going on in his stories. And then they'd bring in Sanderson to clean it all up. Sanderson is also a genius at 3-act structures.
Do you mean Robert Jordan?
Oh, Robert Jordan. What did I say? George R. R. Martin? I meant Robert Jordan.
You did say George R. R. Martin.
Sorry, I meant Robert. Well, guess what? They're both pretty bad at that.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, kind of George R. R. Martin does do that. But then when you said you would bring in Sanderson to clear it up, I was like, wait a minute.
They're both bad. They're both very bad at middles. Like, they don't want to end things. I'll tell you who's really good at ending things. Sanderson. He ends things quickly, my friend. He's very good. If you read his books, he has multiple 3-act structures. He actually, the Way of Kings, the way it works in his books is
all
that
Stormlight Archives.
All Stormlight Archive. Each book is actually 3 books. And he even labels them book 1, book 2, book 3. And each book has a beginning, middle, and end, and they're connected. So he actually writes a trilogy. So when you're reading each book, it's actually 3-book trilogy in one book. So he's a very good example of that. So now, again, this is hard for me to put into adventure terms, but the easiest way to think of it is that don't try to make one gigantic adventure that's all middle. And I think a lot of people do that. It's that they say it's the beginning, and then like level 1 and 2 is the beginning, and the levels 3 through 18 are middle, and then level 19 and 20 are the end. So it's like, don't have 2 levels of beginning, 2 levels of end, and 16 levels of middle. That's a bad idea, okay? People are going to get bored. People are going to feel like nothing's getting resolved. You shouldn't do that. You should have multiple beginning, middle, and ends. Have mini adventures within your adventures. Again, now this is easier said than done. I know we're saying this, and it's like, oh, if this was so easy to do, why can't anyone do it? I know it's tricky. Don't get me wrong. This is tricky, but it can be done. Is that, like, for example, if you have an adventure that you're writing and it takes place in the first adventure in a town, well, then have the first adventure in the town have a beginning, middle, and end where they go through an adventure in the town, find out what they need to find to go to the next area, and then it ends in the town. Like, they go to a dungeon, find what they need, get the MacGuffin, and then move on. And now that adventure is done. Now they move on to the second adventure. Paizo adventure paths are actually very good at this. And that's just because they're written by individual authors and they're individually set, they have to have beginning, middles, and ends. They're not allowed to have the adventures go past one book. So each book does have a beginning, middle, and end, where it starts off the beginning of the book where they have to figure something out, and then by the end they usually do. There's one exception to that I'm aware of. That's Iron Gods, which actually I think is the best structured adventure path of all of them. Iron Gods, books 1 and 2 are a set. Books 3 and 4 are set, and book 5 and 6 are set. And it's very well done. That's actually, I think, the best structured adventure path of all the Paizo adventure paths. Like, book 1 introduces you to someone you need to meet, and then at the end of book 2 you meet that person, and that book is done. So it's kind of like a Sanderson novel. And then book 3, now you meet the next, or have to go to the next big person, and then at the end of book 4 you meet that person, and then at book 5 and then book 6 you eventually end the story. But it gives you a satisfying conclusion because you're not always hanging and waiting to meet these people and resolve these outstanding issues. They get resolved fairly quickly. Within a book or two, you're getting them resolved. So they're continuously making progress and feeling like they're actually moving forward. I'm talking a lot here, Mark. You could talk too if you have any ideas on this.
So I think it's we should clarify beyond just saying that it has a beginning, that it has a middle, and then it has an end, because obviously for people who don't know as much as you do about movies, they might be thinking, oh, well, all the books that Steven said were only all beginning and middle. I mean, they technically ended. What Steven means by this is that a beginning has somewhere where you clarify what the stakes are, what the conflict is, what the situation is going to be. It's sort of a setup section. Some books and movies that that are kind of hard to understand don't do this. They'll just kick you right into the middle, and you kind of have to catch up with the movie. It's like in media res, but done like not necessarily well. Then the middle section is the part where there's going to be rising tension. There's going to be struggles. There might even be setbacks. If you have something that's in a traditional trilogy that has 3 entire movies or books that each have their own sub endings toward the ending, then you might see the middle one as an ending where the bad guys won.
Yeah, well,
like
that's
Empire Strikes Back.
Right. If you're doing the hero's journey, they always have a setback. Always.
Right. So somewhere in the middle, you're going to have struggles, you're going to have setbacks, and therefore if you have like a sort of conclusionary part that's in the middle section, you probably might see the bad guys win or have a setback. The bad guys succeed at one element of their plan. The snap that Steven spoiled there is a good example. And then the end part is the payoff. That's the part where that Waiting for Godot intentionally does not give you, because another spoiler, but they're waiting for him and he doesn't show up, right? So it's a subversion of the 3-act structure because of the fact that it doesn't really have those things. But end normally means this is where the things that you saw at the beginning, they pay off. Everything is connected. It's resolved as much as the movie or show or your game session is going to do so. And it might also set things up for the next story if you're doing a succession of stories, such as, well, an RPG campaign, assuming this wasn't your very final last part of the campaign. So that's sort of what Steven meant by beginning, middle, and end. And you can see from those definitions why it might be true that a book or movie doesn't really have an end section or doesn't have a beginning section, even though, yes, technically it starts, and yes, technically it stops.
Yeah, and we're not talking about a 3-act structure for a level 1 to 20 campaign. That's impossible. In fact, those are the bad ones, and those are the George R.R. Martins and campaigns where it's all middle. They're all
middle.
Yeah, it's all middle
because they don't do enough successive 3-act structures like a Sanderson book.
Yeah, and so Sanderson books are a superb example, obviously. And look, the Star Wars movies, very good example. I mean, I'm not using, crazy examples. Like any standard trilogy of movies, good ones, Lord of the Rings movies, like They are standalone products that are interconnected to a larger story. And that's more advanced, but setbacks. If you want to, if you want to look at the standard hero's journey, that's really good. You always want to have a setback because a setback will really mess people up, but that's like super advanced. And I wouldn't recommend that unless you know what you're doing, because that could really mess up your characters if they feel like that they're actually moving backwards and they're not making progress. It's easy to do in a story that you're watching that you're not proactive in, or in a video game, but in a role-playing game, I feel that's very tricky to pull off. So just be very careful with that.
If you give them a setback, it should be that try to have the villains do something progressive that moves the plot forward, rather than a situation where the PCs are the agents who are trying to move the plot forward and the villains just kind of stonewall them and knock them backwards for their setback. Those are the setbacks that are really frustrating because people don't like to retread ground. Whereas the setback where the villain does something terrible, and then that changes the state, that moves everything forward to something else. And that is one that can definitely be stressful, definitely be like, oh my gosh, I need to figure out what happens next. We need to stop them and make them angry at the villains, but they're less likely to feel just like purely frustrated than if what the setback was just all of the PC's plans, going up into smoke. A good example, I would say, in TV, villains who could do this, who could move the plot forward while also not frustrating the heroes, is Xanatos from Gargoyles. Also, just like other things from. Have you seen Gargoyles?
I've not enough that I know. I saw a couple of episodes, not a lot.
He's just like a villain who he loses every time because he's a Saturday morning villain, but he always has a plan that losing is actually also fine for him. It's not as good as winning, but he's like, oh well, you know what? This breakout didn't work, but it also got my fiance out of jail because she cooperated with the wardens. Thanks, heroes, for stopping the breakout. And now she got out early. And so also other things that were made by like one of the creators of Gargoyles also made Young Justice. And the Light in Young Justice is a villain organization that's also very good at that, where it's like they lose every time, but they're like, okay, yes, but the monster may be defeated, but we stole this one relic from the Atlantean Museum that we need for our other plot. So everything is still going according to plan.
So those are two. So we have always be escalating in the 3-act structure. Again, the best recent example I can think of is watch Andor. Like when you watch it with this in mind, it will be like, damn. Like it's impressive to see it actually in action. The next item I'm going to say is, excuse me, is to use set pieces. Set pieces are big scenes that are often battles, but don't have to be. And that's a set piece is, obviously a big climactic battle in an action movie, like Helm's Deep is a set piece, destroying the attack on the Death Star is a set piece. Those are all set pieces. That's like big centered action scenes. Now,
but for non-battle ones,
right,
in your campaign, depending on what you're doing, like the Royal Ball could be a set piece where the PCs finally make it out in front of the king and the highest nobles of the land and are going there. That's like sort of the anti-usual set piece, because normally they're not going to be something like a ball. They'll be more like a battle or big flashy explosions. But for your game, if it's very intrigue and political, a Royal Ball could be the set piece.
Or a heist could be a set piece. Or meeting the bad guy in a public space and actually talking with him. It's a big piece that, sets up the rest of the adventure, and that is something that either characters can look forward to in anticipation. That's usually a battle set piece, or like a ball or a heist, which is something that the characters are getting ready and that they're actually anticipating and, doing planning for. Or if they're meeting someone or meeting a powerful NPC. And what you want to do with these types of set pieces is you got to make them memorable. Now, this, of course, is easier said than done. It's like, yeah, of course, I'm going to make everything memorable. Believe it or not, you don't. I know this sounds weird, but if everything is memorable, then nothing is memorable. Yep. You actually need highs and lows. You actually need a roller coaster If you make everything awesome, it is actually going to be a boring adventure. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true.
It's totally true. It's a corollary to the same thing that we were saying in the first section about raising the stakes, but
Mhm.
not always constantly keeping the tension up
Mhm.
high. It's just that like people get overwhelmed. It's like when I'm at Gen Con and I go to the hall and just like everywhere there's these colorful booths
Mhm.
that they all look so awesome. And I wind up being like, I don't know
It's
which one
analysis
to do
paralysis.
because
Yeah.
they're all great and there's no reason to do any one of these. And just like if your set pieces stand out above the rest of set
Mhm.
pieces, and this is true for encounter building too. That's something that Linda put in the advanced encounter building section of the Pathfinder 2 Game Mastery Guide,
Mhm.
because she's done so many different adventures as a developer and she's seen what worked and what didn't. And she was like, look, these are the tips for making the most set piece encounter ever known that has like hostages you need to save or all sorts of other elements that were
Mhm.
added into it. But listen, don't do that every time because they're only sort of a
Mhm.
sometimes thing for a set piece. Sometimes you need to have simple encounters. It's true everywhere
Mhm.
as an adventure creator and as a GM.
Yeah, it's like in the movies. It's actually they define the set pieces because that's actually where most of the money is spent. In budget. It's obviously a big action scene, or whether it's a lot of sets or a lot of extras and so forth. So they need to know where they are so that they can actually budget for them. But a set piece should be you should have a couple of them, and they should mostly be. And this is the other thing about set pieces, they should be anticipated. This is the weird thing about set pieces. If you have them occur spontaneously, people might not be aware that they're in the middle of one and then kind of miss the fun and not really like drinking in as much. If you let them know that, yeah, you're going to a big ball where you have to infiltrate, you have to talk to the duke and drug the king and seduce the prince while stealing a diamond. Well, you know what? That's it. That's the big set piece, and you got a couple days to prepare.
Uh-huh.
Like that's a lot that's going to happen, and people are mentally prepared for it too. And then it's a lot of action. A very common set piece is fighting a boss. Now, when I do boss encounters, I not only just have boss encounters, but I have stages of boss encounters. I've mentioned this before. This in video games, they do this all the time. I mean, how many times have you played a video game where it's like, oh, this is not my final form, and then they just keep changing, and it's usually 3 to 4 to 5 stages
And there's a
of
reason we have
combat.
that doppelganger feat that everyone liked
Yeah,
in Battles of Ancestry Doppelganger, where you get reduced to 0 hit points when you're in your alternate form, and then you shift back to your original form. And it's called This Isn't Even.
right.
And
This
then
isn't
like,
even.
and it gives you a bunch of hit points back, and you don't drop to unconscious, and you shift back to reveal your true form.
Right. So this is something I like to do with battles, is that to have multiple steps, and that alone will make it a set piece, because it's like, all right, it's not a quick battle. It's a battle that's going to take a while, and then it's constantly shifting. And I'll get to there's the next tip actually covers that too a little bit. I'll explain in a minute, but it should be something that's really memorable, something that stands out, that's unique, that's something else. So set piece is that, how many battles do you have? You have a lot of battles, okay? How do you make a set piece battle? You can make it in a very weird location. You could obviously make it with a very powerful foe that brings in, strange wrinkles into the fight, whether they have NPCs you have to save during the fight, or whether the ground is shifting, or you're zero gravity, or there's fireballs exploding in random locations, something to make it not a normal encounter that makes people really realize, okay, I got to really pay attention here. And like, I'm using up all my spells today. And again, this should be something hopefully is planned and anticipated, and you should go through your adventure and figure out where the set pieces are, and you should probably have one, like, maybe, I don't know, maybe every month or so. Like, they shouldn't be that frequent, maybe every 2 months. It should be, things that just are really memorable in locations or dealing with events that no one has been able to see before. Again, it's very vague because I'm like, well, what could a set piece be? It's just something that you're not going to do anywhere else in the adventure or very rarely, and then just amplify it and make it something memorable. Which brings me to the fourth item, and this I'm kind of stunned that no one does. And you see this in movies constantly, and I mean constantly, because movies are a visual medium. So one thing you always see in movies is the environment. The environments are always used in movies, whether it's Helm's Deep and it's raining the entire fight, or they're on Mount Doom and there's lava everywhere and the ground is beneath them falling apart, or, the actual use of the environment in an encounter is so rarely used. I'm actually surprised how infrequently this comes up. Now, I get it. It's very hard sometimes to balance. It's also very hard sometimes to run if you're an inexperienced GM, because there's a lot going on, because you have to actually convey accurately to the PCs what's going on and what's happening and why suddenly it's dark and they have like a 20% mischance, or why they have to keep making saves because the ground is moving beneath them, or why there's lava everywhere suddenly, things like that. But by using the environment and actually making the environment part of the encounter, trust me, it's memorable. Okay. One of my favorite encounters of all time is actually in the podcast, is in Three Ring Adventure. They're having a fight with these really tough demons. I mean, they were really, really tough in a library. And then the demons purposely throw fire bombs and set the library on fire. And they're like deep in the library. So they're like, holy crap, we're fighting really hard demons in a library that's on fire. There's a lot that has to go. Like, there's now suddenly a lot of factors and a lot of complexities. And it was really memorable. I remember I couldn't even sleep after that encounter. It was so exciting. And afterwards, everyone was just talking about it for weeks after, because it was just so exciting.
I want to give D&D 5e credit where it is due, that having layer actions is a codified thing that you expect to occur every once in a while makes it easier to talk about it and implement it than in a lot of other D&D like RPGs, where you could absolutely put in amazing environmental things in Pathfinder 2, or just kind of any D&D. Like, you can have the environment roll on initiative, or just go at the end of the round or at a certain point, and have all sorts of things, from like moving platforms that rotate around the battlefield every round, or lava bombs that fall from the air, or the fire that spreads, like you were saying, Stephen. It's easy enough to do it, but by introducing a term for it, like layer actions, that doesn't, I'm not saying that makes it easier to do it, but it puts it in the front of your mind. It makes it more likely for people to remember to do it. So that is a very good thing that they did for 5e.
Yeah, and actually, the way I did it for the fire is that the fire had a turn, and it had a turn in initiative, and then what ended up happening is that, I'm trying to remember, I think what I did is that the fire would roll, and then if it rolled, it was like a 75% chance, basically, if it rolled like a 5 or higher or a 6 or higher, it spread. So it just constantly was spreading, and so it didn't always spread, and that's a little more complex than you need it to be, but some of you could just literally just have it come up on its turn, and it literally just spreads 5 feet, or it gets bigger. There's actually a lot of board games that do this really well. Gloomhaven, I'm sure a lot of people have played Gloomhaven out there. Gloomhaven has a lot of environmental effects because they have a lot of battle boards. Kingdom Death Monster, Oathsworn, any of those battle type games, they often will do that because they want to mix things up, and because they're a board game, they love putting environmental effects on the board, because you're literally using minis, so it makes sense. Obviously, if you play, Warhammer or any of those games, they have environmental effects. But I'm amazed is that so many movies obviously have environmental effects, like during combat and such. So many board games do, but it's extremely rare. It's so rare I can't even think of really too many examples of games or adventures that do it, where you actually have the environment come into play during a fight. The only ones I can think of is when they're underwater, and that's the ones that everyone hates. And that's the one I'd say don't do. Don't do underwater unless you absolutely have to or have some good reason. Well, underwater is a pain, but I know one that did it really well. Age of Worms. Actually, that's a good one. Age of Worms has you start off by investigating a sunken temple, and some of the temple is underwater and things happen. So every level and every room is a little different. So the environment not only is part of the adventure, but it's in part of each room. So some rooms might be totally dry. Some rooms have an inch of water in them. Some rooms are completely flooded and you literally have to swim through and under obstacles in the room to get to the other side. And that's an excellent, the Whispering Cairn, that's an excellent opinion, my favorite first level adventure ever, for anything, period. Actually, I think it's the best one ever written. And it starts off really well, and that's a good example of a dungeon with environmental effects. So, can you think of any?
I think there's a decent number of times that it appears. Again, 5e by having layer actions, just codified actually does it a little more often than some other systems. But the main thing is that it's trickier for people to remember to do that very often unless they're doing a really big encounter. Like I've seen it sometimes in set piece encounters. You can tell that like some adventure authors are more in favor of using the environment than others. Like there's some adventures I've played where you're like in this like lab that has like a giant pod that a monster is inside that's about to break out and it's always shaking and like steam and other things shoot out from and possibly deal damage from like that giant machine while you're doing the battle. And those are always memorable when you use the environment like that. It's more memorable than if they'd gotten the same challenge from like adding more monsters to it.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to do it is you just make the environment in the initiative, and then it just goes when it goes. And that way you never forget it. That's the easiest way. That's how I always do it. I always have NPCs or any traps, just like obviously complex traps in Pathfinder have an initiative track on them. And that's what these basically are. So that's something else. Someone in the chat said Greg A. Vaughn is the master of interesting environment encounters. I can't think of any of his adventures off the top of my head that have environment. They might.
He does a lot of adventures and he just has a lot of encounters. I remember a lot from him that don't have environments, but I'm sure there's some that do just because he's written so much.
Yeah.
In general.
So finally, the last one, and this one is strangely one of the tougher ones to do. It sounds easy to do, but it's actually really tough, is to have recurring characters in your adventure and having them change and evolve and have arcs. So what you should do is if you have a character that you want to have in your adventure that will appear in the first part, the middle, and later parts, give them an arc. And a character arc is how they grow and change throughout the adventure. And obviously, any book you read, this is common, any movie you see. I mean, this is adventure. This is like writing 101, okay? But it's incredible how infrequently this comes up because NPCs are very frequently seen as a means to an end, that they're literally just NPCs. They're there for the characters, and they're there to be used as the characters want for whatever purposes they want. They are nothing more than a tool. And the difference between the good and the great adventures are the ones where there's memorable NPCs. And what I would mean by that is that a good example of this in literature is Gandalf, is a good example, is that you have, and this is not uncommon in adventures, but actually, let me rephrase that. It's actually very uncommon in adventures that you don't want to take agency away from the characters, so you don't want to have this you don't want to have someone who's like level 20 that shows up to the level 1 character and say, hey, I need you to help me out and go on this adventure and do this for me. It's like, dude, you're level 20, why don't you do it? You know, like, why don't you just go off and do it? Or worse, they go and they help the characters do the adventure and then steal their moment and take away their agency.
Yeah, I know I've seen like satirical comics about the Lord of the Rings being written by a GM where Gandalf is the GM PC who's constantly like causing issues. It's like, Helm's Deep, we can do it. Oh no, I think we're gonna lose. Oh wait, no, Gandalf just comes in and solves everything. Or I don't know about these trolls. Oh no, Gandalf's got it. And it is pretty funny to think of it that way. But Gandalf is definitely a very versatile character. I would say the thing that's really important about this tip is to be a recurring character with an arc. They need to be used in different ways. If you just have like the shopkeeper of the inn or the shopkeeper of the general store who's always in the general store, and every time they come to the general store, the shopkeeper is there and talks to them about what's been going on recently and sells them things. That doesn't count all the way of using this tip. But if the shopkeeper eventually is inspired by the PCs and becomes an adventurer, or turns out to be an evil cultist who has learned about what the PCs were doing by chatting with them all of these times constantly, or selling them the wrong thing, or gets kidnapped at some point in time and they have to save him from the bad guys, or using some other ways or some other elements that makes them evolve and change and fulfill different roles in the story. That's pretty important to make their character one with an arc and not just one that's repetitively flat.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I can't give any examples of our adventure, but if Indigo Isles, what made it so hard is because there's so many characters that occur and appear throughout the entire adventure, and they're used in multiple ways, so that characters you see when you're level 1, you will see when you're level 10, and they'll be doing different things. They'll be doing different things at different levels. And that is not only because you're leveling up, but because of the time and part of the story as well. And because of things, they're called into action to help out and do things or just be fun with the characters. I'm trying to think of a real world example. A good example was probably Fall of Plaguestone. In Fall of Plaguestone, you're like, there's a town that's really like doing poorly, and you're called in to help out the town. And in Call Plaguestone, there's one character who's been there like since the very beginning. It was been there since like the olden days, who actually remembers what happened and why the town is called Plaguestone. And this character starts off in our game, and you can listen to it, it's a podcast, as starts off as the old kook that no one wants to talk to, and he's the crazy old man, and eventually the characters go on a quest for him and befriend him, and then he becomes your kooky friend. Now he's a friend, but he's a little kooky. But then it turned out, at least in our game, that one of the characters was actually related to this character, to this NPC, and then it became a whole other thing where they were using and learning their family history from this NPC. So this NPC went from the crazy old person to the quest giver to a member of the family who can not only give out information, but actually was sort of someone to help and protect, and even was like becoming like a de facto part-time member of the actual party indirectly. And that's an example of a good arc of like the character going through multiple stages of growth. You want at least 3. 3 is the kind of the standard. So you have him go from like, I'm trying to think of it. Can you think of any, Mark? I'm trying to think of only ones I can think of are the spoiler ones from our own adventure. I can't think of too many adventures that do this well. That's the problem. It's like so many adventures, because of the way they're written. The reason, okay, let me back up. Why am I having such a hard time thinking of these? Because adventures are written by individual authors, and they purposely don't have the characters interact between chapters very frequently because they don't know what the other person wrote. So usually characters within a chapter, you'll see the beginning, middle, and end of their arc within one book. And
when they do overlap, it's usually that they're a very vague plot device character. Yeah. Not always. But like, for instance, in Shattered Star Adventure Pass, Sheila Heidemark sends you out on all of the quests to find the shards, but like that's just what she does. She
Right.
sends you out to, oh, we've got the next shard. Let's go get the next shard. And that's pretty consistent. There are some characters who have some arcs throughout Adventure Paths. In War for the Crown, for example, Princess Eutropia
Mhm.
has an arc because you are fighting to put her onto the throne of the country.
Mhm.
And she kind of has an arc. Her spy mistress, who is the one who hires you right at the beginning of the adventure path, is kind of still just the quest giver who is mostly static throughout things, but Eutropia herself has some changes and adjustments, and there's other NPCs that you meet who do as well occasionally between adventures. But it's still sometimes a little tricky because some of the things that you're supposed to do later on with some of the characters, you don't always get like the fore information if you didn't buy the entire AP together and read all the way to the end. And so you can think of ways to foreshadow it or to portray it well so that you can do the transitions if you have them all, but it doesn't always tell you
Mhm.
throughout. And that's something that I think Jewel of the Indigo Isles, it's great that like anytime there's a reused characters that are going to come up later with some changes, like they generally tells you at that point, hey, also this character is going to come back later. So just so you know, if you decide to extemporize that they're also have gone to clown school and are a clown, it may also throw up this other thing later on where they're not a clown or something like that.
So a couple of actually interesting questions that came about. By the way, so we do this in Jewel of the Indigo Isle. We have characters constantly showing up throughout the adventure, and now I see why. Because oh my god, it was that hard to do. Because it was written by 3 different authors, so then I had to go in and rewrite significant sections just to have them all connected to each other. And it wasn't atrocious, but it was definitely a lot more work than if you just had this NPC show up, tell the characters what to do, and then never appeared again. As opposed to having NPCs show up and then show up again and then show up again and then show up again, and then you saw them in a different light each time, and saw how they're actually a larger part of the world and environment. We have a couple things here. It's like so. One question, 7 Deadly Twins, is how do you avoid that old guy from coming close to a DMPC? They weren't a DMPC because they couldn't fight. They weren't really good at anything, by the way. So what they could do is they were there for information, and they were there to help out the characters in ways to tell the history of the town so you could find out what's going on with Plaguestone and how to fix it. And because he was the only one that was alive at the time when everything occurred, he was important for the PCs to earn their trust. And again, we just added some new fun things where he was also related to one of the PCs. And then, we just had more interpersonal relationships. So they never really did anything. They never went on the adventures. But they were very much part of the party because, if you wanted to learn more about this character's background, it was literally the PC and the NPC were talking to each other to flesh it out. So that was things like that. Oh yeah, Ruby Phoenix does do this too. You're right about Ruby Phoenix. I forgot about that one. We have another question. Is it's difficult for players to track multiple NPCs? You're right. Actually, you're 100% right. That's why we have very colorful NPCs. Look at all these little pictures. In fact, you see some of these pictures. Some of these pictures are some of those NPCs. One thing we do is we always have a picture for our NPCs so that you can have a picture with their name, and then the PCs can actually have pictures in front of them and say, oh, I know who this is and this because I literally have the pictures in front of me. They always seem to have. Okay, here's a Dan Harmon tip. Dan Harmon, okay? I know this is going to sound insane, but he never lets his characters in his television shows have the same color hair, okay? So, like, he always makes sure, if you look at, like, Community, he makes sure all of the characters are very different from one another. And if they are white females, they're very different white females. If they're white men, they're different white men. One might be young and tall, one might be old, things like that. He's really into visually having all their characters be very distinct. That is not a bad thing to do. And let me tell you, in movies, especially the better ones, that's not an accident. They make sure that all characters are very visually distinct from one another so that they can't be confused. It also helps for international box office when they're trying to translate it. There's all these reasons why they do it. But the Dan Harmon school is that he always has his characters extremely visually different from one another. When you're making NPCs, do the same thing. Like, have them distinct. If you're going to have 3 Gamayans, I mean, we have a lot of Gamayans those are the parrot people. They're all pretty different from each other. Yeah, they're all, in fact, most of them are pirate parrots, but they're all different.
Even the ones who are related to each other, therefore, who you might think, like, logically, maybe they should have the same or similar feather color, especially since their family name is Red Feathers. They still look very distinct from each other.
So that's something else, is that you don't want to have 3 NPCs that look and act and sound very similar. I'm thinking of, that's part of their appeal, though, like in Futurama, the 3 sons of Mom, you know how they all look the same and they all sound the same. But that's part of the joke, is that they're all interchangeable, so you make them the same. You know, you could do that. You can go that route too, is that you have like twins or triplets that are actually like considered one character because they're all keep going on with them. So anyhow,
so that was number 5.
That was number 5.
NPCs, and we kind of gave you several different ways to think about recurring and distinctive NPCs. Do you have?
Oh, I have more. I have more. I have extras. Oh, someone actually said anime. Everyone. They do that too. Yeah, in anime, they do different colored hair. They do different facial and like body structures. Again, this is pretty common, and it's one of these, like, you don't think about it until I say it. They're like, oh yeah, they do that. You're like, yeah, no.
In anime, in like in the original Japanese, where there are a lot of like voice styles, which you'll sometimes see translations try and with mixed success actually do in English. They will also use auditory ways of distinguishing them, where someone talks in, say, ridiculously formal, or has like some weird sentence ending that they put at the end of all of their sentences, and it's the same technique. Yeah.
So again, the top 5, the ones I had, is always be escalating. Always use a 3-act structure if you can. What I really mean by that is have a beginning, middle, and end to your adventures and sub-adventures. Have set pieces. Use the environment, especially in encounters and like memorable encounters, or even just during the day, like have it raining or snowing. You know, it just makes it more memorable. We do that a few times in our adventure. And then reusing characters throughout the adventure and give them arcs where they change at least 3 different times throughout the adventure. And then as a sub-tip of that is to make them memorable by making sure none of them are visually the same or have very striking differences, both character-wise and visually. If you know, it's not all of you are going to go out there, and especially if you're homebrewing, and have your own characters, but give them unique names, unique characteristics, unique ancestries, things like that. So that's those are 5. I actually do have another one. I'm surprised. Right, not one 6. Super chat. There's like I've never had not a single super chat. I'm actually a little disappointed. There's not a single chat. Not one. Boo. Boo people. So that's why we gotta only do. It's like that's why we do only OGL, because no one super chats or asks us questions. Okay. I will give you another one.
All right.
This is a tip from The Sims. Okay? This is actually another more advanced tip. This one's tricky, but I will tell you how it works. So one of the reasons why The Sims was so popular, and why a lot of video games like Animal Crossing and any of those ilk are so popular, is because you want to give characters, or in this case PCs, or in a video game, the player, you want to give them a short-term, actually let me rephrase, you want an immediate goal, you want a short-term goal, you want a medium-term goal, and you want a long-term goal. Okay? You want to give them multiple goals, and you want to make each of them achievable in a certain amount of time. This reflects real life. Real life, you have multiple stages of goals. You have an immediate goal, which in this case is to get through this YouTube show for me. My short-term goal is I have to make dinner for the family for tonight. A medium-term goal is I'm going to Florida next week, so I have to pack and prepare and get ready to go to Florida, and that takes a little bit of planning because I also have to plan what I'm doing there. And then a long-term goal is, I don't know, maybe I'm just using trips because it's easy to use. I'm going to go on a trip this Christmas last year I went to Spain. Well, when we went to Spain, we planned all year for the trip. So that's kind of a long-term goal. So these are goals that you want to achieve for your characters. So whenever you're building an adventure, you'll usually have short, medium, long-term goals. Long-term goal could be, or the overarching goal, save the world. Long-term goal, get one of the three. There's 3 MacGuffins we need to get. Medium-term goal, we need to get MacGuffin number 2. We got MacGuffin number 1. Now we get MacGuffin number 2. And then our next long-term goal is to get MacGuffin number 3. The medium-term goal is we got a clue as to where MacGuffin number 2 is, and we're going to go find out where it is. And then the short-term goal is, well, the guy who has the clue for MacGuffin number 2 really likes raspberry ice cream, so we got to go buy some raspberry ice cream for him. There you go. So you want to give multiple levels of goals. The Sims does this really well. If you ever played The Sims, is that you always have short, long-term goals and medium-term goals. And Will Wright talks about this in any of his books or lectures, and by layering these goals, it keeps you constantly involved in the story, and it keeps you constantly moving forward and checking off boxes as to whether you're doing things really small, medium, or large. This can also be the gambler effect whenever you're doing jackpots. They often, if you play World of Warcraft or any MMO, they do this by giving you loots, and they'll give you loot in the beginning, which is just common loot. Every so often you get the rare loot. Very rarely you'll get the really good loot, the super rare loot, and then once or twice in a lifetime you get the legendary epic loot, and that's called the slot machine effect, where you're constantly getting small, medium, and large feedback and encouragement. So
another thing before, and then we'll get to the super chat about having these stages of goals that Steven mentioned, is it's an important way to help give the PCs a setback without it seeming frustrating, as long as they're achieving that immediate goal in general, the one that they're doing right now, or at least the short-term goal. If maybe the medium goal got thwarted, it's sometimes okay if the very long-term goal has a setback that they're going to have to work their way around, because they already knew that was a long-term goal. And like Steven was saying, people have a framework in their mind for thinking about goals in different stages and in different levels of how long-term they are, and already are thinking for the long-term goal. Okay, I know that's going to be a hard one to get. They're not expecting it. Whereas with the immediate goal, if they get thwarted in that, they're going to be more frustrated, even if it's not as important as the long-term goal, because that was one that they were getting in their mind, they were getting ready to achieve it and to get it, and it got pulled away from them kind of at the last minute. So that's an important way to think about that. Let's go to Drift Speed for $4.99 super chat. Love your guys' stuff. What is the orange dragon with the long snout in the middle? Any advice for a Spelljammer campaign? So the orange dragon with the reddish dragon with the long snout in the middle is a vermilion dragon. It's a particular one in the adventure path that you can meet if you play Jewel of the Indigo Isles, and you can find that character. And I would say for a Spelljammer campaign, just the book itself doesn't have a lot of ship-to-ship rules, so you may need to look elsewhere for that or come up with some of them yourself. But just generally, I guess think about the fact that your campaign in Spelljammer is a exploration campaign. There's a lot of weird like crystal spheres that are out there in different worlds. So think about using an episodic structure, less like a movie like we've been talking about here, maybe, and more like a TV show like Star Trek. The fact that you can go from world to world, or even like galaxy-ish thing, a crystal sphere to crystal sphere, means that you have the ability to do things that are ridiculously high stakes for one world, because to your setting, it doesn't matter that much if volcano planet Volcanus blows up. Whereas if you're setting it on a single planet in a single country, it might matter more if that country gets overthrown to your campaign than in a Spelljammer campaign, that it matters if an entire world explodes. So you need to think about that when you're using the advice we gave you so far in a Spelljammer campaign about how stakes matter, and whether your structure is more episodic like Star Trek, or whether you want a space opera that is more movie-like, like a Star Wars structure. Figure out what kind of Spelljammer campaign you want to run, and then that's how you can figure out what you're going to do.
I also saw someone here, they said, Chris Turner said, I read an article recently about the non-3-act story design structure in refiction.
Kisho Tenketsu is a really fun structure as well.
Yeah, there's a 7-point structure. Like, one of my, actually, believe it or not, and this is like, I don't want to get too advanced, but like, I mean, I really study this stuff like heavily. This is like what I do in my fun spare time. It's like I talk about this with my friends. We talk about story structure. Like Dan Harmon has what's called a story circle, and he even refers to it in Rick and Morty. He has an 8-part structure for his stories. So this can get really crazy. I'm trying to give you guys the most basic of tips, and believe it or not, these are still can be really tough to implement. And then as you get comfortable with something like a 3-act structure, you can do things like an 8-act structure like Dan Harmon, because I actually think his story circle is fantastic, because it actually takes parts of the hero's journey as well as other traditional story structures, and he kind of reinvented it of his own. And I think he used Joseph Campbell's story structure as well. And he really does a good job. I think his stuff is fantastic. However, he's probably one of the most advanced script writers on planet Earth. So probably don't try to like emulate him. You know, it's like, you just won't. I mean, he's just too good. That's like saying, oh, I'll emulate Shakespeare. You won't. They're too good.
If you're talking about Kisho Tenketsu in particular, though, it is very similar to the beginning, middle, end structure in certain respects that Steven was talking about, right? Because the key part at the beginning is sort of the introduction. It's setting the stage. You're figuring out what's going on. And you've got the show where like hardships and setbacks and things like that are happening like that. The main difference is that you then have the 10 where you hit the turning point and you resolve things. You get the crescendo, but the ketsu is the result, and that one's a little different. And I would use actually Lord of the Rings with some of the parts that people don't pay attention to, like when they go back to the Shire at the end. Surprisingly enough, even though it's not, these are mostly used in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese narratives. That's like an example of a Western narrative that has this, is where there's a whole section that is sort of after the finale of figuring out, like, well, wait a minute, there's an aftermath. There are things that our actions and that resolving our initial thing cause that are repercussions that might not be so simple or obvious. And so it's not just going to end right at, and then they lived happily ever after as soon as you pass the crescendo.
So in terms
that's that structure.
So I'm going to think off top of my head, and it's going to be a little, like off the cuff, but I like to use real world examples of things people have played or seen. And obviously, in the Lord of the Rings books, most Brandon Sanderson, especially Stormlight novels. I'm trying to think of some other good ones that are really like strong books or movies. Obviously, believe it or not, James Gunn. I think James Gunn and his structures for his whether you look at Peacemaker, The Peacemaker series, oof, that is a complex series, but that is really good. That's a very good series. That's really advanced story writing, but very, 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 very good character development. If you wanted to see how to like really give complex structures and arcs to your characters, obviously Andor I think is the masterpiece and probably the easiest to follow because it's just literally 4 3-act structures combined into a single story, and they all take place in extremely different environments and places with different characters even, so it's very easy to follow. And that's probably the best example I can think of. In terms of video games, Mass Effect 2 probably has some of the best 3-act structure as well as character development as well as escalation I've seen in a video game for a long time. One of the most complex and best character developments I've ever seen are pretty much most of the Yakuza games. Yakuza 0, which I presume a lot of people played because it's one of the most popular ones. Fantastic, fantastic character development. You can watch like people do multiple hour video analyses of one character in Yakuza 0. That's how complex and deep these characters are in those games. By the way, the Yakuza games, why they're so good, is that the Yakuza games are like video games with movies, because you'll play the game and then watch like a 10-minute movie segment like 100 times. So because of that, they really get to develop their characters, and they're probably the best example of being able to have your cake and eat it too, because the problem with most video games and why it's so hard to do this is that you are the PC and your story is yourself. So how do you give someone else the same story? Oh, you know who does this really well? Witcher 3. Witcher 3 does this. Basically any really well-designed adventure games that have a main plot where you are in control of the character, but it does go on rails and it does go on a predefined story. But also those work really well if you're telling a pre-plotted adventure, like an adventure path or an adventure where you want to have a beginning, middle, and end. It's one of these things, you know, we make fun of it. It's like, oh, adventures shouldn't be on rails. Oh, adventures should be all freeform and they can do anything they want. Yes and no. I mean, like, if that's the type of adventure you want to run and your players want to run, sure. We're specifically talking about adventures that have beginning, middles, and ends, that have a story that you want to tell, whether it's you and the PCs want to tell together, or you want to tell as a GM running the adventure from like a pre-written adventure path. The point being is that you have a story structure and an arc that you want to follow and get to a specific point. Can you think of any? You probably have different analogies that I do, Mark, like anime and stuff. I'm trying to think.
In terms of taking a structure
or taking good examples, real world examples for people to look at for inspiration. That's what I was using.
For story structure?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess just in general, whatever you like, you're going to be able to find as an inspiration. That's just sort of an overall tip. Mm-hmm. Like, maybe you don't watch that many movies like me. Maybe right. You are more likely to watch TV or read a book or play a game, video game. Maybe you are too serious for that. You only watch Roll for Combat Live and then read the news, I guess. I don't know. That seems weird to me, but maybe you do. But even in the news, you'll find headlines that of things that are happening in the real world that sort of fit a structure and can inspire you towards coming up with ideas for what you're doing in your campaign.
South Park. Someone said South Park has great 3-act structures. Some South Park. The South Park movie is much better than the actual. You know what has a great 3-act structure and fantastic character development is Book of Mormon. That is very well written. That is extremely well written. South Park is a little hit or miss because they're also written so quickly. You know, they do them in like 6 days, so they're all over the place on those. But there's also 25 years to choose from, so you got a few good ones in there. I'm trying to think of anything else. This is literally just off the top of my head. God of War 2018 also is that also, but again, these are some of the ones that have such complex structures that they're not even 3 act. They're not standard story structures. These are extremely complex. Mass Effect 2 is probably the best one in terms of goal presentation and resolution. Someone said is that it really is very well done, and it comes to a very satisfying conclusion. And the character development in that game is absolutely fantastic. It's really, really good, which I think is why so many people were so upset with Mass Effect 3, because Mass Effect 2 was so good, it was hard to live up to Mass Effect 2, and Mass Effect 3 just didn't, and a lot of people were pissed about that. I'm trying to see, some people wrote some things about Hamlet's Hit Points by Robin Laws. Analyzes the story structure of Hamlet, Casablanca, and Doctor No. Huh. I actually never read that. I have most of Robin Law's. I have a lot of the books, so I'd be curious to read that and see what they think. Do you have any tricks that you can think of? We gave him 6. I'm trying to think of.
Gave him 6 major tips for enhancing your adventures based on movie techniques.
Yes.
I would say, let's see. In general, I would even be willing to generalize the tip that you made about NPCs and sort of hair color to say that anytime you're introducing a major point, see if you can add one distinctive trait to it in order to help the PCs remember.
Right.
It's sort of like a rule of thumb might be, if you have something that's a new settlement, a new character, a new deity, or whatever that's important in your world or your story, consider adding one very salient feature that helps people remember it, and maybe one secret that you will just put in there that you can save for later in your story if you want to pull that out or have it become relevant. So if you do that, it can help you, especially if, like me, you have a more improvisational structure sometimes and you just want to create things more on the fly. You just create them and have something to help people remember, and then something secret that you can reveal later.
I actually have one that I know that people didn't think of. So I was very strict with my writers, is that I said that everyone's names in the books had to be easy to say, quick. Mark and I have talked about this at length, as I have very strict rules when it comes to names of characters or of cities. And in ours, we have things like Rumplank, Goldcrop, Kraken, Farlight, Seaview. You start to see a pattern here. It's usually 2 syllables. It's usually simple to say. It's usually real world names, or real world. It's not like, where are we going? Zippity zop zop zoo. I'm like, no. No. None of that. Believe it or not, someone who was a wordsmith with names was Rollins for Harry Potter. Her names are really good. Her character names are really, really good.
I'm not sure I agree with that. They're memorable, but there are some that are pretty cringy.
Oh, I didn't say they weren't cringy. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of cringe in there.
Oh, well, you said they were really good.
They are. So... Well, Dumbledore and Voldemort are basically opposites of each other. They're literally dynamic opposites in terms of names. Stephen King is actually also really, really good. Stephen King wrote a review about the Harry Potter books for the New York Times and explained in detail, if you want to go back, why her names are so good. I'm
more
characters.
A fan of Ursula K. Le Guin's comments about the Harry Potter books.
Oh, I didn't read those. Actually, I'd be curious.
People were just asking her, like, what do you think about the Harry Potter books? And she basically said that they were stylistically ordinary, imaginatively derivative, and ethically rather mean-spirited, which I felt pretty accurate to me. And this was long before any of the situations with Rowling, like doing so much hate speech that she's done later on.
Yeah, again, it's hard to bring her up without like bringing up all that. But I will say there's a lot of pretty. She has a lot of good names, I will say, in some of her books. But the point is that I try to make sure all the names are easy to say, memorable, not something that will go in and out of your brain very quickly. Um, Even all of our NPCs, the pre-made PCs, all have extremely simple, memorable, quick names. You want to have them, and they all start with different letters. Little things like that. Like you don't want to have NPCs that start with the same letter. You don't want to have major villains that start with the same letter. Or if you do, you want to have a theme to them so that you instinctively know who's the bad guy and who's the good guy by their name. Okay, like bad guys might have V's and X's and Z's in their names. The good guys don't. Things like that. It sounds weird, but it works.
It just happens a lot. I had a homebrew world where like the evil diabolical empire just put tons of X's and Z's in their name because they thought it made them sound more intimidating, and so that was just what they wanted to do. It was traditional.
Yeah.
Ollie Wright for €6 has a super chat. How do you go about customizing an AP to reflect player choices and their personal goals? How much sandbox do you add around the rails? Now, that's going to be something that varies from group to group, from GM to GM, even from player to player, with different players who want and are comfortable with a different level of that. I think it's important to talk to your players because sometimes it sounds like the gold standard to try to involve their choices and do things like that. But some players, when I've talked to them, have actually been like, no, I'd rather not. I just kind of want to go along with the main plot. And I know Steven has said that his group has sometimes also been one that wants to go forward. So make sure you know what your players want. Once you have determined that your players do want their choices and personal goals to get reflected in there, it's important in your session 0 to figure out what those goals are, at least to start with, and try to find a way to add it into the adventure. And if possible, to work with your player to adjust their character. For instance, when I was running War for the Crown, I had a player who said, okay, I want to make a character who's a wizard, who's born to a noble family, but is very at odds with his family and just disagrees with them. And hopefully, like, they're kind of conservative and maybe on the opposite end of the political spectrum from the group that we're supporting in War for the Crown. So I asked him if he was okay with being from a very particular wizard-based noble family that's in the adventure path. He had some ideas from the player's guide as well. And I was like, what if you are in this family? He's like, okay, that works for me. And because he did that, I was able to set up a situation where just like some of the things that happen in book 2 of the adventure path were just highly connected to his character, and he was meeting his relatives again that he had like kind of left to not be around, and it just felt very natural. But in the AP, it's just sort of like, we're setting you up and faking that you're related to this one family so that you can screw over this other family. And I said that his character was basically part of the family they were going to screw over, but his mom's side was related to the person who had no heirs that in the adventure path they set you up to go to. I was like, okay, so you actually are someone that they would pick for this. That maybe that's why they hired you in the first place at the beginning of the AP. And it just felt like I had done everything like exactly for him, even though all I did was what was in the adventure path, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to our 3-ring adventure, it's funny because you also have to make sure this is something your players want to do. Like, so our 3-ring adventure, all the characters wanted to explore their backgrounds. So we have them continuously changing and adjusting based on, believe it or not, I don't know how this happened. Most of the characters, I was able to just use what was already in the adventure and just say, yeah, that was written for your character. Like, really? I'm like, sure. No, it wasn't. It actually was already in the adventure. It's just weird. It was a lot of weird coincidences. But that getting into a spoiler, one of the characters in the game was raised in the Duskwood, and their character and their mom was a hag. And later in the adventure, you encounter a hag. So I was like, yeah, it's your mom. I was like, really? It's like, you were planning that all along? I'm like, yep. I was planning that all along. Nope, it was in the adventure,
It
and I
just
just
works
used.
out
It worked
sometimes.
out great. Worked out fantastic. So,
In
oh,
part, you can help make that happen by reading ahead.
I didn't
So
even
like
read ahead.
I
It
knew
just happened.
you got it by luck, but like I
I
knew what
know.
I was doing there. And like for instance, in the same War for the Crown game, Linda wanted her character to be a very artistic weapon and armor maker dwarf who was at odds with her older sister, who was very much like methodical. I'm making these for the army, was high up in the military, and was like, well, these need to work. It doesn't matter if they look fancy, they can just look plain. They just need to work. And so, fortunately for me, that was one maybe more like you, Stephen, where I lucked out. Like the military kind of supports one of the other claimants for the throne that is not the one that the PCs support. And so I was able to add in that Linda's character's sister was like in this one city that the military faction was in when the PCs were
Hmm.
going there. And it added a little bit more sort of their rivalry and their being at odds, added a personal touch to that section of the adventure. So just
Yeah.
find a way to hook people in. Players guides for adventure plans really help with this because they're there to help for your players to read and tend to try to convince your players to put things in that will fit the adventure path. We did something very special in Jewel of the Indigo Isles for that, where if you
Oh
pick one
yeah.
of the backgrounds that is in the player's guide, there's call outs that are like, here's a special moment, a special cinematic moment or a payoff for the people who pick this background, or it's a way that they can do something that will help them advance to the next
Yep.
stage with their
That.
background. And that's something that I wanted to add in. And Stephen was like, yes. And he explained to me how it was connected to all of these movie
Mhm.
things and other things like that at the time. He was very gung ho towards it.
Yep.
And so we put it in.
Yeah, I was gonna say we do that. I forgot. I totally forgot. So in Jewel of the Indigo Isle, you choose your background, and then throughout multiple parts of the adventure, your background will specifically take place and have specific actions and encounters based on your background. And then by the end of the adventure, you'll have a big payoff so that you will have been invested directly into the story based on your character. That comes from, first of all, they used to do that in the old my mind's going blank. The old adventures for Pathfinder, when they used to have the factions, and there used to be faction got goals, and then throughout the adventures you'd have different factions, and you get points, and they'd give you little things. But they stopped doing that. But that actually really comes more from video games. There's a ton of video games that do this, like Baldur's Gate 2 does this, and like I can there's a million of them where you pick a specific background, and then you, depending on your background, will get specific dialogue or have specific things happen because of your background. So I always thought that was awesome. So I was fully up for this. So, um, but yeah, that's one way you can do it. Um, anyhow, I think that's enough. I think we gave you like
Yeah.
6 or 7 tips, and my throat's starting to go, and I'm getting sick, more sick.
Yeah. I think this is great. People could refer back to this if you want some tips based on movies and other media to make your game awesome. So thanks for watching,
Yeah.
everybody, and we'll see you next time on Roll for Combat Live.
Yep. We'll see you. And if you want to see all of these tips in action, just check out Jewel the Indigo Isle at battlezoo.com. You can just read it, even if you don't play it. You can read it, and you'll see everything we're talking about, like literally. I don't think a single one of these was not used, plus some new ones. I don't think looking at them, like every single tip we have here is in that adventure. So check it out. And then if you have any questions, do come by the Discord channel at discord.rollforcombat.com, and we'll hopefully have some answers for you and help explain in more detail how we do something or make your adventures more awesome. But otherwise, thanks everyone. I'm really sick, and I want to go. So